You're watching Beyond Market. Welcome. I'm Esther Awoniyi. Many thanks for joining us today. On today's show, we'll discuss the World Bank's Human Capital Plan for Africa. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Market, and you can send tweets to my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther Awoniyi. Now, Sub-Saharan Africa scores the lowest of all the world's regions on the World Bank's Human Capital Index. Now, that's a measurement of how well countries invest in the next generation of workers. Now, the score is explained by high mortality rate and stunting rates in the region, as well as inadequate student learning outcomes, according to the World Bank. Bismarck Rewane, the CEO of Financial Derivatives, is my guest today, and he joins me for today's conversation. Thank you, Bismarck, for joining us today.
Thank you, Esther.
It's been quite a conversation talking about how much we as a people, as a continent, are investing in human capital development. I'm talking about health, education, and how we're preparing for the future of work, how we're preparing this generation, the next generation, for the future of work. And what we've seen so far, I mean, from the Bill and Melinda Gates report on the goalkeeper, and those are abysmal numbers that we saw, indicating that Africa is not preparing for the future of work, but it's preparing its youth and its future workforce for the future of work. But I'd like to hear your perspective, the numbers you've seen so far, the conversations you've heard, the discourse on how, as a continent, we're preparing our young ones for the future of work.
First and foremost, Africa has about 1.1 or 1.2 billion people, which is about slightly less than 20% of the global population, but also contributes about 5 to 7% of total GDP. In other words, Africa, the Sub-Saharan African continent, is not contributing its own share of total productivity and output in the world. Right? 1. 2, labor productivity growth across the Sub-Saharan African continent, especially in Nigeria and some of the, it's pretty much negative or flat. Total factor productivity growth is also low. And the outcome is what you see in terms of outcome is stunted growth. The outcome is lower income per capita, lower consumption rate. And also, let's go back to why this. The input, rubbish in and rubbish out. The input is that we are spending less than we should spend on education and on health. And even the spend itself is not a quality spend. So one thing is the quantum of spend is poor, the quality of spend is even abysmal. And therefore the outcomes, and the World Bank in this program says that if you were to improve all of these things according to their plan, you can actually increase work productivity by 13%. In Nigeria, for example, the IMF says clearly that if female and male kids were given the same opportunity and optimal investments was made in their training and their capacity, Nigeria's GDP can increase by 5%. But you know what 5% is? 5% of almost half a trillion dollars is significant. Right now, Nigeria is going at about 2%, you know, and population growth rate is about 2.83. We need to grow by 4% to cover population growth. We need to grow by 6% to provide full employment, and we need to grow by 8% to actually take off. All of these things are not going to be possible except there's a simultaneous investment in human capital, health, an healthy mind existing in a healthy body, and at the same time investment in gross capital formation in terms of equipment, and then, of course, things like artificial intelligence and all the other things that are coming out. So it's a total package, and I think that's what the emphasis on the World Bank meeting is about. If you don't do something about human capital, then you will leave a good chunk of the people of this continent and the world behind.
Now, before we go into, I mean, the World Bank's plan to increase the investment, help Africa increase its investments in human capital, would you say that there is, I mean, from the conversations that you've heard, would you say that there is a growing appreciation and awareness now on the part of the African leaders, you know, the policymakers, on the need to increase investment? I know, yes, looking at annual budgets, there are so many competing needs. Nigeria, you know, tries, and I think this year there was actually a slight increase in the health budget. But would you think that there's an overall growing appreciation and awareness on the need to increase spending on human and capital development?
There's an awareness of the dangers of not doing it. It's quite clear that there's a correlation between the investment in education and aggregate output 5 to 10 years down the road. In fact, it's getting shorter. And investment in the type of quality of the education, the quantum of the education, right? The monitoring and the persistence ratio in terms of reading, writing, and recognition, the 3 R's. So all of those things are being put together with vocational education. So it's, and then so the outdated and outmoded education of the past. So you've got to retrain a lot of people who claim to be educated but are miseducated. So we have to educate the miseducated, we have to educate the uneducated, and we have to train those there now in both contemporary and futuristic skills, so to make them competitive both domestically and globally.
How can we, I mean, whenever we have these kinds of conversations, my mind always goes to the private sector and how they can help. For education now, from a policy, first of all, from a policy perspective, I mean, without even perhaps spending so much, first of all, changing the kind of curricula that we have to at least, align with today's current realities, and also to prepare the next generation for, the future of work. Starting at that point, can we begin to, perhaps from a policy perspective, policy side of things, begin to effect that change first, to set, just to set the ball rolling before we begin to talk about, okay, how we're going to train or retrain our teachers, perhaps in digital, just, to keep up with the way technology is changing the way we work and live?
Yeah, the curriculum will change as the demand for the skills also change. So first of all, the private sector can only do so much. That is, the demand for the skills are there, and you pay for that, and that's happening already with the likes of Andela and others. So you have these programmers, and so it's changing the curriculum, changing the quality of the faculty. Again, re-educating the miseducated, opening up room for the uneducated, and also making the skills functional. So it's the functionality of the skills and the capacity of the faculties. When I say faculties, I'm talking about faculties at both the primary, secondary, teacher training, technical schools, and all of this across the board. Because global needs are changing so rapidly that the requirement, the societal requirements are also changing. And so the investments in converting the existing, preparing the incoming, and also even the ones that have left the workforce, making them now useful because we are recycling them. The life expectancy is increasing. So what used to be 70 years was permanent retirement age in most countries, Japan, Asia, retirement age has moved to 80. And life expectancy is 85 and so on. So we are beginning to see a lot more investment in the body, the mind, the environment, these sustainable development goals. And so all of this is put together, addressing the needs. But let's go back again and see, how does the federal government of Nigeria, for example, or governments across the continent, on one hand, how are they addressing and how are they organizing themselves to address the education gap that exists?
I mean, what analysts tell us is that, I mean, if they're good, like I mentioned earlier, a good first step would be to take a second look at the curricula, look at what, how, current economic trends are unfolding, especially in the technology space. Do we begin to do more ICT? Do we begin to introduce, I know some schools have introduced entrepreneurship courses to at least, prepare those who want to run their own businesses and teach them how to run their own businesses, to employ people, and of course, addressing the unemployment numbers. So I'm thinking, do we begin to scale on that part?
True. And as an employer, I see a lot of people, and they come from a wide range of schools in this country. The difference in quality between some schools in this country and others at the same level, talking about undergraduate, postgraduate, is just night and day. So, and there's also a correlation between the amount of resources that are going into those schools in terms of their faculty, the curriculum, research, functionality, internships. All of these things come, and you find the products from certain schools get snapped up, while products from others nobody touches them. So we have 400,000 youth corpers in this country, and what are they doing? What is the 12 months of youth corps used to do? What kind of skills do they acquire? What is that 12 months used to do to prepare them? Is it a gap year to prepare them for functionality in the industry, in government, in service, or does it prepare them to go for higher education outside? And how functional is this higher education to this market? So it's that there are some hard choices that have to be made. Again, I go back to the quality. You cannot get quality without paying for it. There's not like a free lunch, and somebody has to pay for it. And we had a conversation earlier in the continent. How much are African countries spending on subsidies, consumption subsidies, when we could shift those subsidies into education, quality of education? Because if you improve that quality of education, it translates into an increased output. Increased output means that the quality of lives of the citizens of this country improves, and you would have less of brain drain. Some people say, okay, even after training them, they're all going to run away. But I think that if the education is relevant and functional, the increased output because of this skill, right? The increased total productivity in the country makes it more difficult for people and less attractive for people to run and emigrate out of the country, because they'll be working in a much more integrated economic setting than you have today. Okay,
Bismarck, well, thank you for your time so far. We'll take a quick break and we'll be right back to pick up from where we left off. I've been speaking to Bismarck Rewane, is the CEO of Financial Derivatives. If you're just joining us, Bismarck Rewane, CEO of Financial Derivatives, is with me today, and we're discussing the World Bank's Human Capital Plan for Africa. Thank you, Bismarck, for your time so far. Now, the World Bank plans to double its investments in human capital in Africa by 50%. It says it will do this through grants and concessional finance, just helping African countries to be more innovative and creative in how they boost or invest in their human capital development. It says it will also target game-changing interventions and leverage technology and innovation that prevent and reverse the damage to human capital in fragile and conflict-affected settings. I mean, concessional finance, obviously that is good news, but in terms of how this money is going to be deployed and where perhaps would be a good starting point, what comes to mind for you?
Well, first and foremost, it's like we said earlier, it's converting outmoded skills, right? One, because there's a bulk of people who would not have the benefit of all the modern education and all of that. You got to commit some resources. But at the same time, changing that curriculum, investing in it, and encouraging governments, because the World Bank can only intervene with so much. But the thing is, it comes up with a model which, if replicated by countries, beneficiary countries, you would find a major quantum leap in terms of output.
One thing, sorry to bother, one thing that's peculiar about this plan is that there's actually a focus on health.
Yes.
The World Bank is actually focused because obviously, I guess we said everywhere, we say it every time. A healthy population, it was a healthy workforce, and of course that translates, feeds into better economic growth.
Yes.
So there's actually a focus on health, rather.
Yes, it's true. Health and infrastructure in a sense. Let me give you an example. The biggest brain drain we have in this country, I'm talking about Nigeria as an example, is the fact that even after you educate these people, then out of one little ailment or one accident on the road, you terminate. So you invest so much, 24, 23-year-old, 35-year-old, in a car accident, boom, it's over. Everything, no replacement. Healthcare. Even if the person is healthy and ruptured appendix tomorrow, it's over. Simple things. So you have to invest in healthcare to defend that which you have already invested in education. Right? Not only is the question of health a condition necessary for good assimilation and education, it's also a condition critical to ensure that those who are educated remain healthy to be productive and you do not lose them, so their life expectancy, you can have increased life expectancy, increase output from these people. So net, the country benefits. So we are investing in their education, investing in their health, and they are giving us a long-term return. But they're working until they are 70, 75, 80, and then that's it.
And you know, it's also a conversation about universal health for all. I mean, that was in the headlines recently. I mean, I think an emergency was declared, you know, on child and maternal mortality rates in Nigeria. We see one of, very abysmal rates across the country. So there's also the ongoing conversation about universal health for all. How accessible, how easy is it for the average Nigerian to get access to healthcare, you know, when they're ill? So I'm thinking, is that also an area that we're looking at under this scheme?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Affordable health. I mean, healthcare across the world is an issue of acrimonious debate at this point in time. But how it's organized. In Africa, you have in some federal, like the federal government of Nigeria, has some responsibilities for healthcare. There's universal healthcare at the state level and the local government level. And so, but it's guaranteed only for consultation. When you go to the hospital, after consultation, the pharmacy and all the other things, the aftercare, right, is paid for by the individual. And that becomes very expensive. So in the hierarchy of spending and consumption, citizens are spending one on education, health, and thirdly on food. So if you provide good health care, if you provide good education, you would have released a lot of the disposable income which citizens are spending on what they consider necessities, because it's an aspirational society. They want to get better than, they want children to be better than their parents and parents to be better than their grandparents. So that massive investment in education, health, to protect that which, you know, goes on and on, and you would see the benefit. And if you superimpose that into urbanization. In African countries now, the big trend is urbanization and deforestation. So when you now see urbanization is almost synonymous with better education and better access to health. So, and that urbanization is only symptomatic of that same trend, which is what we see today.
Now, interestingly, the World Bank also says that now that 23 African countries covering over 60% of the region's population have joined a coalition of nearly 60 countries to join the Human Capital Project. So I'm thinking that is good news. There's a growing awareness, it's growing, because conversations I've had on this issue have centered around priority. Is it a priority problem for African leaders? But of course, all the conversations like, look, competing needs on annual budgets, and of course, those other smaller countries on the continent that are, you know, poor, as it were, simply do not have the money or the required investments, you know, to achieve this.
You know, but also democracy. If there are proper votes, proper elections, and people, manifestos and leaders are coming out, one of the key part of every manifesto is healthcare, education. If you have a proper election, people will be judged on their performance. Leaders will be judged on the performance of not only their policies, the execution of their healthcare programs and education programs. So if we have democracy and proper democracy across the continent, not just election rituals, you will find that by and large, the African leaders will provide and will buy into this whole question of education, health, because that will help them foster their own political aspirations, because if they do not deliver on healthcare and education, they will not get re-elected, and they need to be re-elected. So that alignment of goals between the political interests on one hand and the people's interests on the other, in terms of their education and their, you know, it's actually fostered by this kind of program. Okay,
now going forward with this grant, according to the World Bank, this is the grants and concessional finance for human capital projects in Africa. Part of the package includes totals $15 billion US in the fiscal years 2021 to 2023. I'm thinking obviously this is a good step in the right direction, but in terms of the outcome and the impact, what are your expectations or what are your hopes in terms of how? I mean, we need to begin to see those visible.
It's a tiny but very, very important step, because this is an economy that is growing at a particular rate, and it's $15 billion. The World Bank is not coming to substitute as a government for Africa. But if well deployed and sends the right signal, and you have some models that have worked in certain areas, right? Then everybody can point to those examples where it has worked, and then we all begin to emulate it, because there's no substitute for self-help and commitment. I think that is the key.
Now, interestingly, this conversation on health and this announcement was made at the World Bank's the recent spring meetings that
yes,
we in Washington, and there was also that talk. Just a little digression. Just wanted to quickly hear your perspective on this. The IMF also made some comments. I mean, while we're talking about investments, how African countries are taking loans from China, and that what they've seen in the past is that it doesn't really align with the Paris Club arrangements, and that it's just basically cautioning African countries to be very careful how they take loans from China. It's just to hear your thoughts on that.
The debt strategy of every country is tied to its development and its growth strategy. The Paris Club are donor nations and insist on particular steps before you can get. So you have the London Club of Bankers, you have the Paris Club of Donors, you have the Washington Consensus, which is the IMF and the world, and then you have others. African countries have, in desperation, have accessed Chinese investments, Chinese technology, Chinese trade, to complement what they are getting from the Western countries. But when you put everything together, look at the total debt, and what the World Bank is saying is that do not lose sight of your debt sustainability ratios. Because if you get into a debt trap and you don't have productivity, because all of these liabilities, which have to be repaid at some point in time, if it is not actually complemented with increased output, then you get yourself into this vicious cycle of reducing output, higher debt and debt service, and then that. So it's to avoid that thing, that kind of vicious cycle of poverty and debt, that the World Bank is alerting that please go there clearly with a strategy, project finance, and do some project analysis, proper procurement, right? Proper maintenance and after sale, after investment support. All of those things are what the World Bank and others have now.
Do you think that some countries, especially the smaller African countries, are at higher risk of falling into that trap? I mean, we heard some stories about one or two countries that had some of their major, federal assets, taken over by the Chinese.
Yes, no, it's true. If you are commodity dependent, which is dangerous, if you are in this transition stage of intermediate manufacturing, right? If you don't have fiscal responsibility and sustainability principles, if the pricing of your products are not in equilibrium, then you are vulnerable to both exogenous shocks and domestic political struggles. Because all these countries have elections, they have policies, and in the end, they've got to do something about it very quickly.
Now, overall, I mean, we've talked about health and the plans by the IMF to increase its investments in the human capital. But like I said, this all came from the spring meetings where they look at the global economic growth projections. They talk about individual countries like we've talked about for Nigeria. But then the picture that the IMF painted, I mean, for global economic growth, not too rosy. I mean, obviously
for this year,
for 2019,
yeah,
for 2019, not too rosy.
2020, they're saying, and because of the elevated risks, the risks of trade wars, the risks of Brexit, the risk of global slowdown. So when you're looking at a country's growth trajectory, and you're talking about human capital investment, you're not going to get the result of this human capital investment for the next 5 to 10 years. But if you do nothing about it, or you invest negatively, 5 to 10 years now, your resources will be declining, and your needs of your people will increase, and then the chances and the probability of social disorder and conflict are increased. So one is it's good to increase aggregate output. Two, it's important to increase the quality of life. But more than anything else, it is the only antidote against potential conflict. And those conflicts can be destructive.
Bismarck, I must thank you for your time today. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for being our guest today on Beyond Markets. I've been speaking to Bismarck Rewane. He's the CEO of Financial Derivatives. So that's it on Beyond Markets. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of the show on our website. That's cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets. And of course, you can follow my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther or Awoniyi. From myself and the team, it's bye for now.